Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Level Up, How AI Will Change Every Job in Media, and also marketing, I might add. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Leanna Zamet. I'm the executive producer at Custom. We are the creative content agency deep in the heart of digital media. Today's webinar is presented by GumGum. GumGum is an artificial intelligence company with deep expertise in computer vision. Their mission is to unlock the value of images and videos produced daily across the web, social media, and broadcast television. Since 2008, the company has applied its patented capabilities to serve a variety of industries from advertising to professional sports. And now that I'm done with that boilerplate, I will also add that GumGum's been a partner of ours for quite some time. They're quite dedicated to thought leadership, and we're really excited to do this webinar with them. If you have a chance after the webinar to check out their own publication at thevisionary.com, they write about computer vision and AI quite a bit without, necessarily, pumping up their own products. So I recommend. So a couple of reminders before we get started. A question and answer period will follow this panel, so please stay with us until the end. Feel free to submit questions at any time via the GoToWebinar platform. Everyone who registered for today's webinar will also receive an email with a recording of the session, so stay tuned for that. Today's webinar is actually a sneak peek at GumGum's upcoming report of the same name. To get down to these statistics, which we're going to present today and discuss, GumGum surveyed more than 400 marketing and media executives to find out how the industry is progressing with AI. They also dug into how each department is faring within the industry. And I would like to also introduce our participants today. We're joined by Max Fresen and James Cueta. Max is co-founder and head of creative at XD at Born AI, and James is executive producer at Havas Cognitive. So welcome, gentlemen. Before we get started, James and Max, can you tell us both a little bit about how you came to work at agencies mainly dedicated to AI?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. So I started Born AI about a year ago with a partner, friend of mine from the agency world as well, and we started Born because both of us were, we're for a long time vets of the larger industry world, both at small shops and big shops, and ultimately what we saw was a big gap between the technical shops that were coming in with all of the sort of AI, pipes and lights, and the way that creative agencies were ingesting that and wielding it and bringing concepts to clients and brands and people. We think that, the tech part of it is we're already utilizing a good portion of what's actually possible from a tech perspective, but there was really very little creativity being applied to the application of that stuff into the real world. So we had an opportunity to start this agency that was AI focused and build it from the ground up, so that as AI kind of comes through and disrupts everything, including agencies, we wanted to try to build this thing to be a full sale that would take advantage of it rather than have to adjust for it. So it was a very deliberate move on our part, trying to simply get a little bit ahead of the curve and be set up to take advantage of the best and brightest people that are coming out and working in this field right now.
Great. James, how about you?
Sure thing. This is James. I echo Max's thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Havas Cognitive Havas is a very large global advertising network of agencies around the world. Havas Cognitive is a global innovation practice that sits horizontally across that. It's a small team of data scientists, technologists, strategists, and experienced designers, really focused on helping our agency network create more valuable customer experiences to drive business impact. So the way that manifests itself is that a lot of times we get brought in to augment existing creative or tech teams because we do have a deeper understanding of some of the data science and technology around cognitive and artificial intelligence. I found myself here specifically. I had been working within sort of general digital for quite a while, and then I spent some time at a small healthcare startup that was starting to get into a lot of data science. And from there, jumped to Avast Cognitive coming up on about a year ago. The practice has been around probably about 18 months or so. And I'm specifically focused here on some of the more healthcare related projects that we're trying to bring some of these artificial intelligence solutions to.
Okay, awesome, guys. So we're going to jump in now with some of the report's findings. We have this, sort of executive summary. We found really that marketers have kind of a modest understanding of AI. 60% have read about it or are familiar with it, but haven't really worked with it yet. One statistic that I found notable was that really only 13% are worried about automation replacing their jobs. And that's good news. That's good news. That means that most of the industry has the right perspective, despite a lot of the hype around, the rise of the machines and so forth. Tell us a little bit about, why those other 87% are on the right track.
On the right track in terms of not being worried about being replaced by a robot someday?
Exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look back at human history, there's very little evidence for anyone being rationally afraid of new technologies. I mean, they don't tend to actually replace people in that way, right? Like what they do is create different selection pressures on the market in terms of what skill sets are required. So, I don't think we're talking about anyone being replaced. It's more a question of, are you paying attention, adapting, and picking up new things along the way, right? We're in that kind of an economy where we're really continuous learning throughout your career is necessary, and I think this is just another, road sign on that path.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. Sorry. This is James. I would agree. One of my favorite engineers that I ever worked with used to say software is stupid. And even though artificial intelligence is extremely powerful, and that's why we're all here today talking about it, there's still a long way to go before we see something like the rise of the machines. Estimates from, some leading researchers put kind of artificial general intelligence or something that would be more of what you might imagine as a sentient robot out like 30 years from now. So there's a lot of time to lay the groundwork for how we're going to ethically work in that world, and I think it's right to not be overly concerned.
Great. I mean, and it seems based on these statistics that most are already using some form of AI based on off-the-shelf technologies like programmatic or content personalization. These are, software services in most cases that have AI baked in.
Right, exactly. It's already here, right? Like the AI did not get born yesterday, right? Like AI has been something that has been in progress since the 50s, at least, and where it has been insinuated into things for the last 20 years in terms of consumer-facing products. People just aren't aware of it, right? But I mean, the stock market, right? Like financial institutions have been using machine learning and AI types of algorithms and neural nets for years and years. So again, I think to James's point, right? There's a long stretch of time before we get to a place where AI is at a general intelligence level. And for the time being, it becomes, just another arrow in your quiver.
Wonderful. So the way we're going to progress now is we're going to sort of dissect a variety of roles within the media and marketing world. We've broken these down into avatars: the marketer, the media executive, the creative, the strategist, the UX builder, and the seller. We're going to get started with the folks who are really at the center of it all, the top of the food chain, who are, the brand side marketers. What we found here, and I think this is a particularly interesting statistic, is that while 19% are worried about the technical learning curve, 30%, and we gave them a variety of concerns to choose from, are really concerned with finding the right application. In interviews, what we found was that, marketers are not quite at the point where they are fluent with AI and really are relying on their agencies to guide the way. And since you guys both work at agencies, can you tell us a little bit about what you think your role is right now, and what questions are your clients coming to you with?
Well, I can say we get a lot of requests for chatbots. I think that's kind of the early weaponized version of AI, or like I always describe chatbots as like the foot soldiers. If you're thinking of AI as a larger sort of play, which it is obviously, and then a lot of the conversations very quickly turn into, like we didn't realize how deep AI was going to affect things, right? I think like the natural sort of impulse is to look at it as a new, it's Flash, right? It's this new thing that we can use, but really when you look at it, it sort of replaces an entire layer of business intelligence within the organization. So a lot of our conversations over the last 12 months, at least speaking personally, have been an ever expanding set of conversations with larger and larger groups within brands as we kind of bring, I wouldn't say we do a 101, right? But there is a lot of sort of like education going on in the initial conversations before we get to a place of figuring out, okay, great. So we as a brand, right, who owns what? How do we do the governance? Whose budget is going to go into putting this kind of a central stack in, and then who pays for the individual implementations on that stack? It's very, very, very reminiscent of the late 90s conversations that people used to have, if anyone else is as old as me and was around then. There was a lot of, well, the CTO brought us in to talk about digital, but as it turns out, right, the CMO needed to be in the room too, right, or vice versa. I think we're still kind of in that phase with a lot of brands. Obviously, your mileage will vary. There are some that are way more up on this than others, but that is by and large the conversations I've been having more often than not.
Yeah, I would agree, Max. I think where we've seen success in general is when you start small with these things. One of the challenges that you just brought up is often the data sources required to do something novel often reside in a bunch of different places or have ownership from different areas of the organization. One way that we've tried to get around that is to start small. So if you think about there being a bunch of these data lakes around, is almost bring the right people to the table and have a champion who's a client of yours who can get someone from the CIO, someone from product, and get the right players in the room together and kind of take water samples from those lakes and do a small discovery project, kind of clean up some of that data, see what's there, see what you might be able to power with it, and then some agency folks in the room who have the background and the expertise in some of the AI solutions out there to get something built. And then what we have seen in many cases is when we do create something small from that process, it can have effects across the organization in terms of how they think about their business when they see some of those impacts. One other thing that I would say is in general for marketers is in order to gain some fluency with this stuff, just take a look at some of the large providers out there or even smaller players, but go to take a look at IBM's site, Google's site, Microsoft's site, take a look at some of the services they offer and the demos that are available there, and you'll quickly start to get a good sense of kind of the state of commercially available artificial intelligence parts and pieces that can be put together to form kind of new experiences or business applications.
Yeah, James, I think all of that rings pretty true to me. I think something occurred to me as you were speaking that I'm sure you probably have encountered as well, but I think the other big conversation that we have, and that last bit that you mentioned is super important, right? The idea of the architecture of it. There's a lot of commercially available stuff, but like with all of these platforms, right, there's pros and cons. API.ai is great if you don't care that Google has all of your data and that you're helping to train their stuff to get smarter, right? TensorFlow is great as long as you have a deep stack Python engineer that can help you to set it up, right? So there's pros and cons of both things. And I think depending on where the brand sophistication level is in terms of their philosophy of data and, what kind of DMP they've got, et cetera, those conversations can get very, very complicated, or they can be, very straightforward. The other part that occurred to me is, I think marketers, we're talking about how marketers in particular, how their jobs are sort of changed by AI. One of the big behavioral changes that needs to be made, and that is, an interesting conversation to say the least, is letting go of some of the control over what happens, right? So you can script an AI to do a lot of things very pro forma, but it's really, really powerful when you start to let it make decisions on its own, when you don't sandbag it with a bunch of heuristics, right, with a bunch of preconceived notions of how things should hook together, which is what humans is what we do, right? It's our unconscious and our conscious biases. When you let the AI operate without those biases, it can often find very interesting signals in what appears to be noise, right? Or it can make very interesting decisions about what to do to solve a problem. And that can be really terrifying for marketers because there's, I think, historically always been this notion of everything is super locked down, every little last bit of copy is reviewed and polished within an inch of its life and so on and so forth. And over the last 10 years, we've seen the agile methodology sort of take over in the agency world or in the world of XD and building things. And that's been a little bit of what we're talking about, is sort of letting go of this idea that everything has to be perfect at launch, that it can get better, you can launch in beta, whatever. But this is that to the nth degree, right? Learning to get used to the idea that there's an AI that represents a body of thought, that eventually you need to be training it to make decisions without your input. That's a very scary world for marketers. But it is one of the more interesting conversations that we have when we go in and talk to people.
Great. So it seems like, in addition to generally understanding AI, knowing your sentiment analysis and natural language processing, right? And the technical fluency that they've always needed, right, to be able to tell, the bright, shiny objects from the innovations of substance. It seems like the skills marketers are going to also have to develop are the sort of coalition building. If you're really into AI, you're going to need to know how to bring the right people within your organization together to make it happen. And then also sort of let AI take the wheel mentality where you're just sort of willing to, just get a little zen about it. Great. So let's move on then. We have a media executive. Now, the media executives, based on news reports, seem to be the most vulnerable here, right? Because if we think about AI being jobs that are dull, dirty, and dangerous, or taking over jobs that are dull, dirty, and dangerous, we could also include data here. And 90% of media executives said that at least 1/5 of their output involved data analytics, a lot of reporting for media executives. Where do you see AI being able to up-level media jobs? How is this going to augment the media executive?
Well, I mean, I think most media agencies, well, I don't know about most, but a lot of media agencies have spent the last 10 or 15 years basically trying to sell DMPs to clients, right? Trying to sell DMPs to brands. And I mean, I don't know, I've been in many of those pitches, right? And the promise is always you're going to have all this great information from your card consortium, and then you're going to have all this information from your in-store, your POS stuff, right? And then you're going to have all this marketing data, and all the lines get connected, and then boom, you've got this great view of your customer, this, the fabled singular customer view, right? It's just that nobody mentioned that you'd also need an army of data scientists to actually get to that point, right? Yeah, we can build you the bucket, and it's got all the data in it, and you can make, whatever sort of schema decisions you want about how you're going to tie it together, but you don't really have a way to go in and interrogate that data and find surprising insights, things that you would not have otherwise found. AI is that last part, right? It is the great signal finder within the noise. So I think if you're a media executive, you should be excited, because what you actually have now is the ability to take the vast amounts of data that hopefully you've been helping your brands and your clients to build, and actually do something with it that is very interesting. That goes beyond simply saying like, well, now we really know all the magazines this person reads, or we know what shows they watch because we've connected ComScore or whatever. This is a different level of that, right? This is like, well, maybe we need to find different and more interesting data sources to plug in and cross-reference. Like, what's their workout data look like right now, right? Like, what kind of mood are they in? We can get into a much, much more subtle and nuanced view of a customer that doesn't just get into day part, but gets into biochemistry part, right? Like, what mood is this person in? What mood are they the most likely to make X, Y, and Z types of decisions in, et cetera. So I think it actually just expands the dimensions in which media can operate. So while, yeah, it does take care of some of the more rote tasks that people do today, I think it opens up a whole world of more complex tasks that they will now have the headroom to go and think about.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Let's move on. The creative. The creative is fun. They are not worried at all. They are just not worried at all about AI taking their jobs, despite the fact that, IBM Watson cut together a movie trailer this past year, and in fact, we have a clip from a songwriting bot that was trained on 23,000 Irish folk songs. His name is Bot Dylan, and if you listen in, it's not terrible. Yeah, it's not terrible. It's not genius either. But, creatives feel pretty secure here. And in fact, a lot of, the data prowess that creatives might need to forge ahead on AI, they're already working with data in a pretty significant way. 47% said, yeah, we're doing this. So, Max, you were talking about sort of the creative gap in terms of AI. Can you tell us a little bit about, where you think that gap is and how you think creatives can fill it?
Sure. I mean, when I think about the most sort of obvious lanes for AI to play in the creative space, and I don't really separate creative and XD and UX. To me, it's all kind of one thing. But if you're thinking about really pure, like traditional, art director, copywriter teams or whatever, I mean, I have to admit, part of the reason that I went and started Born was because, it won't happen tomorrow, right? But 5, 6, 7 years from now or whatever, like, I don't know if I'm still going to pay, 20 teams of junior, AD and writing pairs to throw bad ideas at me while I curate and pick the best ones and then help them to iterate on that, when I can have an AI generate 1 million campaign ideas for me and curate and pick the best ones from there. And that's not to say that we wouldn't still hire juniors to do things, right? I think, again, that the selection pressures are going to change in terms of what skills we look for from creatives. So that gap exists not only in terms of, I think, people even considering those types of notions, right? Like, is the AD's job to sit down in Photoshop and come up with stuff for me, or is the AD's job to help train a neural net to pick the right art for the right situations? Both of those things are things I would pay somebody to do, right? I think the question just becomes which one becomes more valuable for me over time. So that's one type of skill gap. I think the other major skill gap that I see anyways is long-form narrative, character building, and most importantly, dialogue design is not something that is typically hired for at ad agencies. It's something that gets hired for at like a video game company instead. I think we're going to start to see those kind of industries blend a little bit because we are moving into a world where, and again, I don't mean chatbots specifically as like this very narrow sort of commoditized thing, but this idea that you are going to be generating natural language in some form or fashion to respond to people via an AI. That requires a different type of writing than ad copywriting does. And that's not like, I know plenty of ad copywriters that are all frustrated novelists, so like, I'm not saying that talent does not live in that world, but it's not always championed as like the raison d'etre for those people to be in the building, and I think it will become that over time. So I'll stop rambling now, James, let you jump in.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on this. I mean, to kind of build on what you had said around chatbots and voice first, I mean, I think we're at a moment where, if you think about our interactions with machines over time, we have things like the keyboard and the mouse that are these very artificial, kind of contrived ways that we could interact with computers. We've moved more towards kind of natural language messaging in a typed format, which is a little bit more natural, and now moving all the way to voice first, which is kind of as human as it gets and as basic as it gets. But I think, to Max's point, like the skill that's required to write a great voice first interaction that goes back and forth between a human and some artificial intelligence powered thing is different than it is to write for a written chatbot, is different than it is to write for any traditional ad medium. And there's a blending. While we see sort of increased specialization within creative because of these new form factors and types of things that we're designing for, there's almost a need to blend between what we would have traditionally thought of as UX and technology and creative, because you really can't design, I think, for the world today without a pretty basic understanding of some of the technical elements of it. So there's a strange hybrid happening of, I think, increased specialization while also needing to broaden kind of the creative abilities there. And I also think that the point about scale, you know, and I don't mean this in a to be disrespectful, but there is an aspect of creative that is trying a whole bunch of different things and throwing things against the wall and seeing what sticks. And that is an area where artificial intelligence can help, you know, generate a whole bunch of things that a you know, very skilled human can really curate and determine what's good, what's not. But there may be ideas that get generated through that process that, you know, wouldn't have been come up with otherwise, just due to timing constraints or headcount.
So if I'm a copywriter coming up with, like, you know, 15 different taglines for display creative, but I'm really interested in getting into AI, you know, what's my next step? What do I need to do to sort of make that jump?
Well, I mean, I mentioned video games. I think to some extent, thinking through, I mean, at a really, really simplistic level, right? Like, video games have kind of gotten that choose your own adventure style of branching narratives down pretty well. That's a good place to start to think about how you might tell a story in a modular way and allow someone to kind of go through a series of decisions and get to different, you know, dialogue endings or whatever. But I would also say, like, working on writing dialogue is really the most important thing. And the fact is, like, our NLU capabilities are good, bordering on great. Our natural language understanding, in other words, figuring out what somebody wants based on the way that they've chosen to phrase it in natural human, you know, language. But really, on the generation side, like, it's pretty bad at it, right? Like, the bleeding edge is not bad, right? If you look at, like, Tay is considered this great failure because she turned into, like, a horrible, like, racist, you know, Holocaust denying Twitter bot, which is true, but at the same time, like, it worked, right? Like, this thing learned to write its own tweets. It's just that we trained it on garbage data. But that's the bleeding edge, right? Like, most brands are not going to be operating with something like Tay. Instead, it'll be something where a lot of the stuff has been written ahead of time. And in that regard, I think writing dialogue is really the weakest spot for most writers, right? Like, it's difficult to do well. So if you're a copywriter and you're trying to differentiate yourself and turn yourself into somebody that's super, super valuable and that's going to get asked on to those projects early, I would say concentrate on being able to write really good dialogue.
Cool.
And to anticipate what other people will say. Yeah.
All right, great. Let's move on to the strategists. So the strategists, the great thinkers, the grand planners. What's interesting about what we found with the strategists is that 42% said the biggest benefit so far of AI has been more accurate or predictive analytics, but only 10% said their own department has benefited most. So I wonder why you think that is. Do you think it's because the application isn't there yet, or do you think they're just not quite seeing the big picture yet?
James, I keep jumping in. Why don't you run this one, and I'll piggyback on
Sure.
that.
Could you repeat the second stat that you just mentioned?
Only about 10% said their own department had benefited most from AI, despite the fact that 42% said accurate and predictive analytics was the best return on AI so far. So do you think that's because it's not really yet being applied by the strategy department in a productive way, or do you think that the strategists are not really seeing the full picture of how AI either is benefiting them or is not or it will benefit them in the future?
Yeah, I think it could be both, and there might be some, in addition to some semantics here, some of just the silos that happen with job titles and departments, et cetera, within kind of organizations. There's no question that the capabilities that AI brings are extremely valuable to strategy. I mean, if you look at the report that we're talking about right now, or the slide deck, I mean, it's full of statistics, right? And being able to munge up those statistics in ways that could bring about new insights that might inform strategy is something that traditionally, we haven't necessarily had either the expertise or the manpower to do. So I do think that strategy strategists, strategy departments will certainly benefit from this, and it might just take a moment for kind of the things that traditionally happen on sort of the back end. If you think about analytics as like a post thing and strategy being a pre thing, we always look for that loop, but the loop doesn't always exist. And as that loop continues to develop, I think we'll see strategy certainly benefiting more, and they'll be more aware of it.
Yeah, my guess is that, well, first of all, I totally agree with you, James, that some of this is about, I don't know what you mean exactly by strategists, right? Are they brand planners? Are they, product strategists? Or are they, it really depends on the agency that you're in and what that title means to you. But I mean, I would say, if you're a strategist, what you want to know, what you want to understand is people, right? That's your whole thing. You're trying to model other people's behaviors and predict sort of what they'll do next. And so, I mean, obviously data is important for that. I would say that most brands or agencies have not yet built truly compelling AI experiences that start to generate, I think, some of the data that's actually possible to generate. And I think once that actually happens, once you actually are capturing and indexing these vast amounts of very semantic and very emotionally driven sort of data about people, I think strategists will start to find this much, much more immediately useful to them and more tangible, because it becomes something that they're accustomed to gathering through focus groups, but now they'll be able to capture it at a scale of millions, depending on how good and how compelling the actual creative application was from the last thing that you did. So it becomes a kind of virtuous cycle. I just don't know that we've really hit that tipping point yet.
Yeah. Just following up on what both of you said, I was looking a little further into the data that we have here on hand, and overall, the industry feels that AI is mainly being applied only somewhat effectively to date. So that may very well be part of it. But I think for strategists in particular, one of the things we heard is that they're the ones that are going to be deciding which experiments to run. They're the ones that are going to be deciding, which information to feed in to, see what the various outcomes are. So yeah, that's definitely something. Statistical modeling might be something that strategists should really be boning up on. It might become a little bit less of an alchemy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think data science is going to become a part of what it is to be a T-shaped person at an agency. I mean, there will always be, I'm sure, dedicated data scientists, but I think all groups are going to have to start to take on a little bit of that role as well, or at least an understanding of what's possible.
Okay. Fantastic. So now we're going to move on to the UX Builder. The UX Builder is funny. Someone during the development of the report said that UX builders were sort of considered sort of the stepchild under the stairs for a while. They were mainly thought of as the people that made things pretty, but they've developed into much more of that, and AI is going to take them even further into that Can you guys comment on what you see for the future of the UX builder?
Sure. So I've had the good fortune of being the guy that gets brought into agencies over the last like 10, 12 years to make XD a thing, right? To find a way to fuse UX into the creative group or into the whatever group that they think it needs to be blended into. So I will say that, I feel like over the last 10 years, I mentioned the kind of agile methodology. I feel like UX has been woven in pretty tightly into the creative group, especially as advertising agencies have become build shops just as much as they are, production studios, if not even more so. So, I think UX's the big impact that they've had to date, which is to kind of set the table for moving fast and breaking things and, doing rapid prototyping instead of a bunch of UX deliverables. And I think actually all of that is super, super valuable because that's the right mentality with which to approach something that moves as fast as AI. So just at like a very esoteric level, I think that's true. I think when you look at what AI really represents for the, for the market overall, I think the service design, which is an element of UX that is often overlooked in the agency world, I think service design is really about to become the sort of X factor in the success of a brand in general. We talk a lot at Born about the death of choice, this idea that, as we start to use, so we're talking about how brands are going to use algorithms, right? But people are going to be using algorithms more and more, and they already do, right, to help curate what it is that they're even exposed to in the first place. So at some point, you'll pick up your phone and say, Siri, get me a car. You don't really care who it is. It can be Lyft, it can be Curb, it can be Uber. I mean, all you care is that a car shows up and takes you to wherever it is that you want to go. So the algorithm on Apple's side in this example, right, is going to go and make the decision about what to pull in for you. So whereas we used to concentrate on things like search engine optimization, which is obviously its own specialized field, I think we're going to move into a world of service design optimization, right? So how do you build the service of your brand to appeal to an algorithm, right? So what is that algorithm even looking for, et cetera? All those are going to become new rubrics that have to be built and solved for, and that is squarely in the arena of the UX builder.
Yeah, I would build on that to say that something like search engine optimization, I know one thing we talk about a lot is what does that look like in the voice first world? It's one thing to see a page that comes back with 20 links on it and maybe someone gets down to the third or fourth link, but in the voice first world, much like what Max was just talking about, like a lot of those decisions are getting made and you're being presented with the best option. So how do you think about optimizing experiences and services in such a way that your brand can win? But also, I think to the point earlier about kind of user experience and UX and experience design kind of and thinking about creative bleeding into technology, et cetera, I do think what we're seeing is we're already seeing experience designers who have changed the tools that they're using to be more like technology. So they're not necessarily drawing wireframes in InDesign and a flat program. They might actually be using live code where they're already thinking about what the responsive design of a particular experience might be, and that handoff is going to have a technical component to it as well. And I think as we've seen that evolve, we're going to see AI services just become another piece of the UX toolkit, and the flexibility of that designer to think about all of those tools at their disposal is going to be really key. One other point that I wanted to make is, and I know is something that is in the forthcoming report, is around ethics and kind of the role of user experience designers in that world. That's something that especially Jason, who runs our group, speaks about a lot. And for anyone who isn't necessarily getting a really clear picture of what ethics within artificial intelligence means, I would direct you to take a look at Moral Machine, which is a project out of MIT that puts you in the position of actually making decisions about what's happening with a self-driving car. So giving you scenarios where you're essentially choosing if the brakes fail, are we swerving and hitting these people? Are we going straight and hitting these people? What if these people were crossing against the light versus following? So there's all these different things, and it starts to become very clear that there are huge discussions and kind of standards that we probably will need to adopt as an industry over the next number of years as these experiences and the power and responsibility that comes with them grows.
Yeah, that is a super, super good point. And I'll second what you said. That moral machine thing is like, it is a very, very, very cool little website to go play with. And I think you nailed it. Like it really does illustrate, like in very stark terms, like what the dilemmas are for people. Because, what AI promises, right, this ability, the two halves of the coin. The first is, the ability to understand what a human being wants, and then for a machine to understand that, and then for the machine to infer the best possible response to that need. That is like the core of what XD and UX people care about, right? Like that is what they represent in the room. They are the users. They care a lot about presenting the right stuff at the right moment to the right people. And so AI really amps that up. And I think to your point, like there's going to be a desire there's going to be a drive to kind of pull as much data as possible out of people and to do as much with it as possible. But it very quickly does sort of cross several ethical lines that we have to start to think about, like how do we really deal with PII in this world, and so on. And I could go on for that, but there's also like digital rights management. I mean, we're looking at stuff right now that takes like 30 minutes of somebody talking and can break it all into phonemes and map it all to the right inflection point specific to that person's voice patterns or whatever. And then it's, you can type in whatever you want into a text file and make someone say it, right? Make Morgan Freeman say the line. Right? Waves kind of does a little bit of it, but I'm talking about something at a bigger scale. Yeah. That's a crazy world, right? Especially for agencies. I mean, think about if you're someone who's ever done a book recording for Audible, the thing you signed gives Audible all the rights to your voice for that book. And if that's all you need to build a model of that person's voice, where does the likeness clause come into effect in terms of, protections for the talent? So all of those things have to get sorted out at some point over the next year or so, because that stuff's going to become more and more prevalent.
Yeah, and I think that
sounds like you guys are going to have to start hiring in ethics officers.
Yeah, maybe.
I think that's the real thing, and it's probably not going to be the law that's going to happen first. I think we're going to see more of a grassroots movement to sort of establish some of these guidelines, because history tells us that the legal system will be many, many years behind helping to solve these problems.
Okay. So last but not least, right, the seller. We wrap in here not just salespeople, but also customer service agents. And I think they've been, as you said, chatbots have been on the front line, and that's where brands have adopted a lot of their first AI application is through the chatbot. But those chatbots are fairly limited so far, and even applications like Salesforce Einstein, which uses like predictive analytics to predict when a salesperson should jump into a conversation, is not necessarily going to replace the human touch here. Or am I wrong?
Well, it depends on how long of a timeline you're talking about. The fact is, like, it takes time to train these things. There are some CRM bots, like some CRM companies that have been, they've done CRM for like the last 20 years. They've got 20 years worth of chat logs that they can annotate. Like that is a really awesome set of data to train an AI on. And frankly, like some of their bots are virtually indistinguishable when you're talking about certain subjects, right? Like they're really good at identifying when somebody wants to make a return and helping them go through the process or whatever it is, right? I actually kind of do think that, 2 years, 3 years from now, I think you're going to start to see call centers get shrunk a bit, right? It may not be massive at first, but it's the logical place for people to start to invest their time and money. If you run giant call centers and you can shave 5% off the operating costs, that's a massive savings for you, right? So since the incentive is there, I think that's actually where some of the strongest conversational AI resides today. And I suspect that those brands that really specialize in that, the shops that really specialize in that, are going to get just stronger and stronger. And really is no reason that you couldn't have, one human, I call it the rigor model, right? It's one human sort of overseeing 50 bots that are all talking at the same time, and they can jump in when they need to. But the fact is they need to so infrequently that they can manage that, right? It's how Amazon thinks about their drones too, right? It's like one pilot flying or overseeing 6 or 7 different drones, et cetera. So I think we are going to start to see that. But again, it's not about necessarily replacing people wholesale. It's about asking people to have a slightly different skill set, right? So having the ability to oversee a bunch of other things that are happening at the same time and jump in when needed, all of a sudden that becomes something that you would pay a premium for.
Yeah, and I think...
Go ahead, James. I'm sorry.
Sure, no problem. I think that one of the assumptions that I think a lot of people made early on was that, chatbots or service agents or whatever you want to call them might kind of replace a lot of low purchase value kind of sales, and not necessarily some of the higher, more expensive items where you might want more kind of one-to-one personal service. But I think we've seen examples of that even not being the case, where people are actually willing to make relatively high-value purchases, through totally computerized means. And so, I do think I would agree that, there is going to be some level of fewer call centers, fewer agents. There probably will remain certain areas where sales people will continue to do their job somewhat like today, but just with a lot more data at their fingertips. So we're going to see less, cold calls and kind of more really targeted abilities for people to make recommendations that the user or the customer is going to want kind of the first time, and being able to shepherd that process along as a human is good at, where we'll see it continue. But this is an area where I think of all the kind of archetypes we've talked about, is one of the ones that I'm the least sure about kind of where things go.
All right, so I think that's where we wrap up. We do have time for a short Q&A, and we did get some questions in, so I'm going to bounce a couple of those over to you guys, and we'll get some of the audience's questions answered. So, first out of the gate, assuming an agency has no AI implementation currently, what are some good first steps to take to get on track with AI adoption?
James, you want to jump in?
This question was for an agency that doesn't have it? Yeah, I mean, I would probably look internally if it's an agency that has some technical capabilities already and is used to building things. There's likely someone on your team who, in their spare time, has been experimenting with some of the capabilities of AI. And I would look around, and you might be surprised to find a couple people who have kind of taken it upon themselves to verse themselves in some of this technology. I wouldn't go and look for a new head of AI to necessarily try to bring it in that way. I would really look more ground up and see if you've got some of the skills, maybe on the experience design side as well. And try out a couple of things. Maybe try some things internally. I mean, internal projects often can be a challenge, even though they seem like they should be easy. Sometimes they're some of the hardest ones. But see if you can form a little squad that'll try a couple of things in the corner, and bring it to the rest of the group and see where it goes.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, any agency can sit down and decide to build like an internal bot that's going to help people to navigate their HR or whatever. Like it's pretty easy to construct an internal use case for this that to your point, James, like we'll fully vet all the people you've already got in terms of their ability to do this sort of thing. But more importantly, it'll expose all the places that you're weak so that when you do go make hires, you actually, have a reason for hiring certain skill sets as opposed to just, hiring a head of AI or whatever, which is a total BS thing right now.
You mentioned hiring, and that brings me to another question. Now, in terms of talent, right? We're talking about people in existing jobs that want to level up, but where is the new important talent coming from? What skill sets, emerging skill sets, are you looking for in new hires, potentially out of school, for example?
So that's a really good question. I think we're in a really interesting gap period right now where the schools have not adjusted the curriculum to start to produce like 22-year-olds that are like ready to go into this world. But I have found that, younger folks tend to be naturally T-shaped these days anyways, or what an older person would look at and consider to be T-shaped, what they just consider being a person alive in 2017, right? Like understanding technology very well. And I think sci-fi, this sounds stupid, but I think sci-fi and video games, I think a lot of these things have already primed culture for the applications of these things, right? In terms of just like what's possible, what should we be aiming for? I think it's always been like that in human culture. Roddenberry invented most of the stuff that people today are still trying to figure out how to build, right? Like we crave these things. So I feel like it's not about finding like brand new, like new programs at schools or whatever, but it is about being more selective about who you pull in, right? I think you need to find people that are really hungry for that kind of innovative sci-fi type of ambition, and those are the people that will most easily absorb this stuff. I think the advantage of being in these early days is that there are experts that come out of comp sci, right? But their interests very seldom align with the interests of an agency or a brand. So I think you're still in a period where you can hire people that have got the right critical thinking skills and the right ambition, and they can learn how to do the stuff from there, right? The hard skills are less important right now than I think finding the right type of mentality to attack these problems.
Okay. All right, great. What about resources? Are there any blogs, books, podcasts that you guys would recommend to the audience to follow up and kind of educate themselves on this stuff?
James?
Sorry, I was on mute. There's a couple of, there's a newsletter that a guy named Sam DeBrule puts out weekly called Machine Learnings, which I look to as a great resource, generally as a pretty good summary of some of the developments in the AI space, and runs the gamut from, stories from New York Magazine or The Atlantic all the way to more MIT type stuff. That's pretty good. I would also recommend, there is a podcast called AI in Industry that takes a look at, usually it's an interview with a company that's doing something in a specific vertical that is around AI, but talks about kind of the implications of this technology and how it may affect various industries. It's called AI in Industry. That's a pretty good one. What about you, Max? What are you reading and listening to these days?
I think machine learning is good. I'm familiar with that as well. Maybe I'm just like basic, but like I have a Google alert that's set up to troll for certain keywords that are in this world. So for me, it's kind of an ever evolving set of publications that talk about it, but it's the usual suspects. There are certainly really super deep like AI, comp sci, tech nerd things that you can go read and listen to. Not that that's what you mentioned, James. I'm just saying there are those too. I don't know that that's as generally interesting, but frankly, MIT Tech Review, Wired, the usual suspects run a lot of stuff about this. If I was going to pick another property, I would say Kurzweil AI, Ray Kurzweil, who's famously one of the big AI people out there in the world, and he's at Google now. But his personal brand, Kurzweil AI, has always put out a great tech newsletter that captures the best stuff going on, and increasingly it's AI focused. And I would say, like, this also maybe seems kind of basic, but DeepMind, they have a really good blog. They publish a lot of white papers over there these days. That's always very interesting because of the possibilities that it opens up. Facebook and Apple and Microsoft, they're getting a little bit better at publishing their white papers and publishing their findings, but those are also places to pay attention to, just because they have a certain eye towards brands and market that I think makes the content seem a little bit more relevant to the people in our industry.
I would also tack on, if you're looking for something fairly entry level, the Harvard Business Review just did a very nice series called The Business of Artificial Intelligence. It came out in July, and you can just simply Google that, and it's very well written and researched, so it's a good primer. Okay, great. Let's see. I think we have time for just one more question. It's a pretty simple one. How much programming knowledge do you need to be able to speak intelligently about AI?
Programming knowledge? None. To speak intelligently about AI, none. To speak intelligently about machine learning, a bunch. You can say the broad stroke, but unless you really understand statistics, it's going to be pretty tough to explain machine learning intelligently. But certainly you can understand what it does. It's nothing completely mystical. But the AI stuff, I don't think you do. Obviously, like, a Python person is going to be able to talk to you about how they set up their neural net and whatever. But I don't think that the conversations in which that becomes relevant are few and far between.
Yeah, I would agree. The level to which I think you need to get that, the level deep that you need to get is not that deep. And when it even comes to technology, to the earlier point about kind of taking a look at some of the services that are out there, any developer who understands how to use basic APIs can really start to take advantage of this stuff. So there's an easy in there. But if you're not technical, I think understanding what the capabilities are, you don't necessarily need to understand exactly how it works in order to talk about it.
Okay. All right, guys. Thank you so much to our presenters, Max and James, for joining us today. Thank you to our sponsor, GumGum, and thank you all to you, our lovely listeners. I would encourage you, and I think our presenters would join me in encouraging you, that if you're interested in AI, the playing field is still relatively open. So start running. Educate yourself, take chances, experiment, wheedle into meetings, and I think while the learning curve might be a little steep at first, there's plenty of room to grow. Agree?
Yeah, 100%.
Absolutely.
All right. All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.